fails in this aspect has no business being in the office. And when we speak about capitation, we do realize that there is a capitation deficit, and this deficit should be bridged by the government. And I strongly call on the parliament to review these policies so that every child can be able to receive the funds that are required. Dennis, if you consider the amount of funds that are allocated to different people, for instance, the president, while seated at State House, has a allocation for education. You wonder what he has to do with that kind of money. The governors are allocated this money. The national government CDF fund has been allocated funds. Even the MCAs and so on have funds. And remember, the High Court once made a determination that the CDF is unconstitutional. But as we know, the members of parliament have been able to go around and even amend the act and so on and so forth. Therefore, I would like to say that in Kenya, we have adequate resources. We have the funds that are sufficient to educate every child in Kenya. If we can review our policies and ensure that we create a national education fund that would ensure that each and every child in Kenya is guaranteed their right to education.
Well, I mean, let's look at the number. In 2013, 53,000. There was a reason why the 53,000 was arrived at, and that it was going to cater for certain things so that schools could then hold children in positions of dignity even while they were studying and learning. Now, what we've seen is that a lot of these schools, and it's not just the ones that are highlighted with stories in the press or in the media, across media platforms, but that this is happening across board. And if I want to look beyond the initial emotion of all of this, and taking into consideration that another penny is unaffordable by a lot of parents, another penny, I'm not saying another 1,000 shillings, I'm saying another cent is unaffordable for a lot of parents. And while that may be true, do we take into consideration inflation, the rising cost of living, and all these things to maintain the dignity of these children as they study? Those are things that we know from the report of the commission at that time that were taken into consideration. Does the ministry take it into consideration when it says today that there's a 53,000 shillings mandate by schools right now? Are all of those things taken into consideration, and should they be? And is a 100% increase over the last 11 years justifiable?
Well, first let me, say that there was a reason, like you said, for 53,000. And times have changed. So it's incumbent on the government to reflect this when it comes to, new amounts that are being put into schools. So that has not been done. And it's a failure on the part of government. It's not a failure on the part of the principals and kids and parents. So that should have been looked at, and should have, adjustments should have been made. Secondly, there should be an attempt, a clear attempt to ensure that if you say this is the limit, then you back this by force of law.
Yes.
We don't see any punishment. In fact, it's the first time I have heard that a principal is being punished for raising school fees.
Yeah. Whereas this is
the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Our bodies get serums and washes, but underarms only get deodorant. That's why our new breakthrough formula has pure hyaluron and vitamin C to deeply care for your underarms for soft and even skin tone in 2 weeks. With 72-hour sweat and odor protection, try the new Nivea Derma Control range, because your underarms deserve more. Nivea is for skin.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
I don't like it when parents only complain after the meeting.
Well, this is interesting, if I may interject at that point, because when we go for this orientation, or whatever the case may be, there's a part of that orientation that is not just telling you about what the school is about and its history and all of these fun things. It's also telling you, and it's said very clearly. I mean, you serve as an assistant minister in this ministry, but they tell you very clearly, they don't mince their words, and they say, yes, we receive money from government, but sometimes it doesn't come on time. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. And do you know what they tell you? Would you want your boy or your girl to not have the resources required for us to deliver this education? So that is how you're greeted with it at the very beginning. So it's almost as though you have no choice but to acquiesce to this. And if the resounding majority says, you know what, guys, actually, and you can imagine you're taking your girl or your boy for the first time, they're going to boarding school for the first time, and the farthest thing from your imagination is that they should suffer in any way, shape, or form. So if somebody says to you, okay, this is what the government says we must charge, but if we had a little bit more, we would then be able to ensure that your child will then be able to go along. Trust me, he will pay.
Yeah, I know there was a parent in one of the schools in Kenya who, when they were told, when they spoke to the principal and said, look, we know this is the limit that we should be charged. You know what the principal told the parent? You can ask Kilemi Mwiria to take care of that.
Yes.
Yeah. So in that sense, I want to agree with you that, and then you are a parent.
Yeah.
You are a parent. You can see the reality. The problem is, it was not just that.
Okay.
There was also a taking advantage of the loopholes.
Okay.
That, once parents begin to, appreciate that we don't have enough, we know the schools don't have enough, and our kids have to learn anyway. And if your child is taken to a top school, a county school or a national school, I mean, there's so much prestige and so much pride about it, you would take no chance to have that kid, get out of that kind of school. So you give in. But there's also a problem. There's another side to it. The parents themselves. These levies are supposed to be introduced after parents have accepted.
Okay.
Yeah. So parents are consulted. There's a parent representative in the board of management. But the problem is that some of them have to compromise. You want favors from the
school administration,
from the school administration, from the principal. You are afraid that your child would be victimized if you don't do this. Yeah. So and then you are given certain types of incentives as a parent, and they give in. So that's why I was saying I kept on complaining about why don't you complain there rather than after the meeting on the way home is when you are saying now
because of those same things that you've mentioned.
Yes, I know,
you don't want your child to be victimized because they'll know this Dennis is this kid's father and he has made noise in the meeting. It becomes a thing.
Yeah. And you are a parent.
Yeah. I mean, we look at this and it's a systemic problem. Because why do I say that? Let's look at budgets since 2015 as compared to now. The budgets of the country have continued to increase, right? And with that and the cost of living going up, everything else has increased with it. But there has been or rather we are not aware of any policy change or any policy discussions that would get to address the problem in the schools, especially when it comes to capitation. So therefore, one would ask the question, what will it take for us to start having these discussions to ensure that whilst parents are saying we cannot go beyond 53,000, the government needs to sit down and look at the budgets, the way they've moved, and look at how they would increase capitation to schools. Because the more we continue to sit here and not changing capitation that goes to school, the more we see the problem. Schools will continue increasing these levies and hide them into development, into school bus, and we need a dormitory here and there for us to do that. So what must we do? Is it about time that we started having this discussion in terms of changing the policy and coming up with consequences for those who do not respect the policy? Because like we've just heard, this happens. We know about it, but we look the other way.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Basic Education Act is very clear on how unlawful levies need to be handled, and also the Board of Management of Schools that is established under the said Act is very, very clear on the role of the BOMs, and any fees, any levies that have to be increased first have to be approved by the Board of Management, and then the county Education Board has to review the same before the CS for Education gives the final approval. And we've seen a lot of violations of the same act in cases where principals inflate the fees in gross violation of the said policy. But that said, Dennis, the Ministry of Education recently carried out an audit of Alliance High School and I believe many other schools. And the report that has been made public really shows where the supposed hikes are supposed to be allocated. For instance, there have been mentions of trips to Dubai for staff that cost about 25 million shillings, and other schools also charge the motivational fees and so on and so forth. Therefore, if you consider the justification for this increased fees, it's not even due to inflation, which we know has grown to about 46%, as Dr. has mentioned. But what are the reasons why the principals charge more levies? We realize it's all about trips abroad. It's more about motivation of teachers and so forth and so on. And even that aside, we also know that there are other hidden costs. For instance, a student joining high school needs to buy school uniform, which is also very, very expensive. We know that Basic Education Act outlaws admission fees, and yet schools, especially in the urban centers, charge as much as 10,000 shillings for a child to be admitted into grade 1, for instance. And this is really not acceptable. Now, back to your question in terms of policy and the like, I would like to reiterate that considering the budget for education in Kenya, I do insist and repeat that if we can consolidate all this money that goes to the MPs, to the president, to the governors, and so on, then we'll be able to close that capitation
Let me just
deficit.
That. There has been that conversation on collapsing all these funds and put it into an education fund. So one then would ask the question, is there political goodwill or lack of it? The reason why we are seeing everybody wants to have their fund close to their chest because they have turned that to be a political tool for campaigning.
I would say, without fear of contradiction, that members of parliament have failed the child in Kenya because they use the CDF and particularly the bursaries as a political tool to reward those who support them and to punish those that don't vote for them. Remember that the Convention on the Rights of the Child has principles, and one of the principles is non-discrimination. And these MPs, Dennis, would even require the parents to produce voter registration cards to prove that they vote in Langata or in Bakassi or wherever a constituency. And this amounts to discrimination on the basis of political affiliation and so on. And therefore, unless and until the people of Kenya call out these MPs to review these policies and uphold the decision that the High Court made in regard to the CDF, then we will continue to talk each and every year about capitation deficit and so on.
Okay. If I could add something to this, the political side, part of the problem we have is that we have very much politicized education decision making. So it's not just about the logic and, So going back to politicians, the thing is, with increasing population, So also are the numbers.
Yeah.
But the real problem is that we are establishing secondary schools all over the place. Every new member of parliament comes, they want to establish a day school. Even though there was one established by the one you defeated in the elections, you don't want to, support that. You want to start another one. So there is no time there's going to be enough money to support our education system if we're just going to be building schools without checking whether or not they're efficient, whether or not, through a professional process of school mapping and identifying the demand. So that's a problem. There will never be enough teachers. There will never be enough money. But I want to go back to the point you made, Dennis, if you allow me, about budget always, getting bigger. Kenya we spent more money than most countries in Africa on education, 25 to 30% of the budget. The question is, does all that money get to where it's supposed to get?
Yes.
So for me, one of the biggest issues with the problems we are experiencing now, it's not so much that principals are even asking for more money.
Exactly.
It is because the money that is voted, nationally, we know that 30% of the budget is lost to corruption.
Yes.
And that also applies to education. So then we hear of ghost schools, of ghost teachers, of ghost students, of very exaggerated procurement, processes, of corruption in, of tenderpreneurs and so on and so on. So of books never getting to schools, although they've been paid for. So there's a real big issue about how much of the money that is actually voted goes to schools, and I'll not be very surprised if it doesn't even get, more than a third is lost. If we can take care of that and we prioritize basic education, we'll be okay. So the first thing is to deal with corruption. And corruption, sometimes I used to say when I was in government, that often we blame the principal and the teacher, but we never blame the people in Jogo House.
Absolutely.
For both performance and how these monies are being used. Absolutely. So the buck does not stop at the principal. It starts right from the top. So we have to address that. There's so much money. How much of it is getting there? What are we doing with the corruption that is taking place, at the headquarters so that the money doesn't get there?
And I think
what are we doing about the corruption that makes the appointment of principals not be based on merit, irrespective of whether or not, they qualify for this? So these are issues that need to be addressed. And if we can solve the problem of corruption at the top, then will be listened to when we want to address it at the level of the school.
There you go. I mean, dropping nuggets of gold here. And I think and this was my question, I think, to both of you. Because is it possible that the ongoings of a national school, which is essentially an appendage of government, are unbeknownst to the Ministry of Education? That can something be happening, especially as concerns money and resources, at a national school, not even just a public school, a school under the Ministry of Education, and that you're unaware? Because, and usually when you're making a point, you can give a story. There's a school in Vihiga, right? This story was reported a few months ago, where a Form 4 leaver is serving as a head teacher because there's nobody. And the story was reported that the county director for education is well aware of what's happening in that school, but she just said, it's okay. You carry on. I'm aware of what's going on. You just carry on. And then when we are able to get to it, we'll get to it. If they can be aware of a Form 4 leaver who is unqualified to run a school, basically, they are aware that situation is going on. You mean to tell me that when school fees have been increased where a BOM has their say, that the ministry can now tell us, in fact, now we need to investigate because we didn't know what was going on? Is it possible?
Well, in fact, the larger question is, why is it that we are discovering now after all these years
Thank you.
that these things are happening?
And why is a principal now being scapegoated over an issue where the ministry should have taken a role and responsibility a long time ago?
And where it is not only, unique to that school.
Exactly.
I mean, we know it's happening everywhere. So there are issues also about how much we supervise what's happening in our schools. But there is also the issue of whether or not there isn't any conspiracy between people at the top at Jogo House and those in the schools. I mean, there are relationships between, senior people in government and especially principals of top schools, because these people also need favors. They want from one places. They have people they want to, get to be awarded tenders, to either to supply books or food and this. So it's not that it is not known. It's that we lack the commitment to take action. Yeah. Just like we lack the commitment to take action about a lot of the other things that are going wrong in the country. And I don't know if I can repeat this enough. Education is only a subset. It's only a subset of what is happening in the wider society. The problems we see in education reflect the wider society.
Yes.
So if we are complaining about loss of funding, about inefficiencies with ministries and with county governments and so on, it is not surprising that those problems will be reflected at the school level. So whether you like it or not, we have to solve the larger problem, and this larger problem is about leadership. It's about the corruption that we can't deal with, because if we can't deal with it at the top, then we should not be surprised if we see the same problems right at the bottom. And unless we come to terms with this and realize that the problems of the Minister of Water, the Minister of Health, and so on, are very little to do with the ministries themselves, rather than with the wider leadership under which they fall, we would be getting nowhere.
I also think it's important to note that the Ministry of Education conducts audit from time to time, and those very audits are able to flag any irregularities, unlawful levies, and so on. And further, the Auditor General is on record to have flagged various irregularities that happen in schools and also in the Ministry of Education, where, as Dr. has mentioned, we've seen a lot of ghost schools, about 32 ghost schools that received billions of shillings, and Kenyans keep wondering who made those authorizations. How could the ministry make those payments? And that clearly demonstrates that there is seeming corruption within the Ministry of Education. And for us to address this effectively, it is very, very important that the Basic Education Act is repealed, so that the CS for Education can have the legal basis even for taking strict actions against the principals. Because as we stand now, our principals are directly answerable to the Teachers Service Commission, which is an independent commission under the 2010 Constitution. And we have seen a lot of power struggles between Ministry of Education and the TSC, which in consequence undermines the right of children in Kenya to access education.
Yeah. Dr. At the time when you were the Assistant Minister and implementing free education at the time, what made it work then? That we, in retrospect, when you look at what is happening today, things are not working. Because you talk about free education. Many go back to during Kibaki time and they say, even the Gen Z that we see today are a product of free education and the masses that went to school, and we see them out today, and the fruits are the same. What made it work then that perhaps we are missing today?
Yeah, I'll tell you. I mean, there was a lot of debate about whether or not that would be implementable, given that it was not even planned for. Remember, Kibaki government came in, like in the middle of the financial year.
Yes.
And yet, we said, look, this was a promise. We have to come up with the resources. So the point is that resources were made available, and there was a follow-up to how those resources were being utilized. You remember when there was a scandal about textbooks, for free primary school education, the then Prime Minister Raila even suspended the Minister for Education.
Yeah.
In other words, there was action being taken. And, you just spoke about the Auditor General's reports. The biggest problem we have in this country is that we report, but we do nothing.
It's just a report, yeah.
And, we have governors come to the Senate, nothing happens.
Nope.
Yeah.
How many governors have you seen, get held accountable for corruption?
They're not even showing up.
Yeah, they're not even showing up.
Not even a tenth.
So I think the point I'm trying to say is that, it's what we see from the top influences a lot of what is happening. So there is no action taken.
Yeah.
Everybody can see that, there are good schools. And there was a PS in the ministry there, and that PS gets moved to another ministry. Even though you can track a lot of this problem to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question then there is, because then what happens with a lot of this information? You just brought up, I remember with devastation when we sat in this room and precious talents building, fell and children died and many were injured. And President Uhuru Kenyatta in that year asked for, by the 31st of October, for a report to be given on the state of schools across the country and their safety. In the moment, I don't know whether it was a knee-jerk reaction. And at that point, we said, absolutely, we need to know if these schools are running the risk of falling on our children, then something needs to be done. We never heard about that thing again. So then you start to wonder, quality, and one of the many things that someone like Wilson Sossion says, of the few to me that I would take to heart, is when he talks about quality assurance of certain things, not just of physicality, but of processes. So when we start to ask questions then about this reportage that you ask for, where does it go? Where does it end up? And then one of the bigger questions that you want to ask is, maybe you can help us here, former Assistant Minister in Education. As of 2024, the amount of money that had not been paid towards capitation, which was budgeted for, was 64.2 billion shillings. That was 2024. The number now has steadily increased over time with, so you don't pay some 3,000 per child here, you don't pay some 2,000 here, it adds up. And so now we're knocking on 70 billion shillings. I'm curious, where does this money go?
Well, I think you can figure out, your Kenyan for this last many years is that you have heard of something called budgeted corruption. Yeah, where you budget for things that are never provided, but it's in the budget. That applies to education, it applies to water, it applies to health. So one of the easiest ways of stealing money is to put it in the budget. But there is no close follow-up on whether that money has gotten used for the purposes for which it was meant.
But is the ministry not concerned? I'm sorry to interject, because to follow it. Because if the cabinet secretary today or the minister then says that we are releasing capitation to schools, over time 5,000 shillings was held by the ministry because they said for development, right? Yeah. This development that teachers are telling us they need an extra money to pay for dining hall, that's supposed to be development,
yes,
right? But it's withheld by the ministry. So where does it go? And then, if we're talking about 70 billion shillings, if you were to take 70 billion shillings today, you would solve quite a good amount of the issues that schools face, for which they're asking parents for this extra money today. That's the reasoning now behind this question of, if you told people that we're sending capitation and term one you sent less 3,000, is there thinking in the back end of the agents of education that, hello guys, we actually have not sent this money, this process then cannot complete?
Well, you see, that's why we were talking about corruption, not just in the education sector, but in other sectors. The question is, if that money doesn't go to schools, it goes to somebody else's pockets, And those are the questions we should be asking, and those are the questions the Auditor General has been, talking, kind of highlighting throughout.
Yeah.
So, unless you hold people accountable, what is to prevent you from repeating this the following year and the year after?
Sure.
We are not holding people to account for stealing public funds, and stealing public funds that make it impossible even for kids to go through school. So it's a very serious problem, and that's why I keep on going back to the issue about leadership. Is the mother of all problems. If we don't deal with it at that point, if we don't address the issue of accountability at the top, it is hypocritical to think that it will work down there. And if we vote for funds and everybody knows they have not gotten to schools, because if this money doesn't get to schools and is voted for, certainly, it's got to some pocket.
Yeah.
So if we don't ask those questions and hold those people to account, then we do not have the interest of that child at heart, really. But that, that money can be voted as an excuse, but you want to use the child to...
Davis, I want to look at Parliament as a body that approves budgets. Parliament as a body that has the power to oversight. And Parliament as a body that is also handed over the Auditor General's report. Because this is a body that then would be the saving grace for the children of this country, for the education of the country, for the parents of the country. Why? Because the 70 billion that you're talking about, as Parliament discusses, say, a budget for 2026, 2027, it ought to sit back and say, we voted for over 700 billion shillings to go to schools between 2025 and 2026. And we can see that it did not end there. Ask the difficult questions and ensure that we find out where this money went to. Are we therefore saying today that Parliament is the weakest link to addressing issues in education because they've failed on oversight? They've failed on accountability and ensuring that these monies are spent as per the law.
Thank you very much indeed, Dennis. First, I would wish to carefully state that Kenya has faced fiscal constraints, and the fiscal space has been constrained to the extent that a lot of public funds are being spent on debt servicing and so on and so forth. Secondly, it is on record that not all the money that is budgeted for education, and particularly capitation, is actually released by the Treasury. And the Treasury in this context is actually acting contrary to the law, because once the Parliament has passed the budget, then it is not in the domain of the Treasury to sit down again and decide how much money that they should allocate for education. I think it is very, very important that they do release all the money that has been budgeted for. Remember, the CS for Treasury at one point said that the government is not able to support education until there was a lot of public concern. That is when he decided to withdraw this statement. Therefore, I would wish to call on the Treasury to respect the will and the wishes of the people of Kenya once a budget has been passed. Thirdly, it is really important, as you have said, to mention that Parliament has an oversight role and so on. We would expect the Committee for Education, for instance, to summon the Treasury officials and interrogate them and really find out why the money that is being allocated does not really reach out to the people. And lastly, we know that there is a percentage of the capitation fund that is usually retained by the ministry for what they call, buying textbooks, development, and so on and so forth, to the extent that even 300 shillings that had been allocated for health insurance is no longer being remitted to the schools. And now they are forcing all parents to register with SHA. And we know clearly that SHA will soon collapse. All signs are clear that they are not able to sustain it. So I would wish once again to call on the Parliament to play its roles and really ensure that children in Kenya can access equitable and free education for all.
So if I could just say something about the Parliament, the oversight role of Parliament and the Senate. And I am sorry to say that we are in a situation where we have all seen as Kenyans that to a very great extent, sometimes Parliament is an extension of the executive. And also, that goes to Senate and sometimes the judiciary. It's unfortunate that, for example, have you seen any minister being vetted by Parliament being refused on account of not passing the Chapter 6 of the Constitution? Have you seen that? No, as long as you're nominated. So, I mean, there's no time in this country in recent past we have seen Parliament say no to the executive. And so if Parliament is not saying no to the executive, so to what extent do you expect Parliament to be able to hold them to account? And secondly, it's Parliament itself and budgets. There's a lot of negotiation between ministries and Parliament, and and sometimes some exchange of the usual Kenya, to be able to not oppose anything the ministries are proposing. So if there is corruption at that point, and the Parliament gets compromised and the Senate gets compromised, we are on our own. We are basically on our own.
What's the saving grace?
Honestly, David, so how do we, I mean, come on, it's, whereas education was meant to be an equalizer amongst persons, it is a right according to the Constitution, which was then put together and agreed upon, and then became the ruling law of the land. How then would you expect such a thing to play out if the very things that Dr. Muira is talking about today are happening? Can it ever be realized? I mean, we want to say we can be positive, but we also have to come to grasp with the reality of the day.
Well, what I always say is that, and maybe I'm a bit extreme, but I always say, if you are poor in this country, if you are sick and you are poor, if you are poor, you are on your own. Basically, you are on your own. And that's extremely unfortunate because, like, when we started, we said, for most Kenyans, for the majority of Kenyans, their only hope to be upwardly mobile is through education. But they have lost that chance. And when they lose that chance, it's not just a loss to the individual, it's a loss to society. Because all these countries you talk about being developed, Singapore, South Korea, and so on, the main reason they're out there in Japan is because of their human resources. You cannot have a country develop if you leave 60% of the population out of the development process. And that's what we are doing. So sometimes we just think that it's only a personal family problem, but it's a national problem that needs addressing. And I think the sooner we realize this, the more we'll be dealing with the problems that are making it impossible for us to get to be Singapore.
Davis.
Well, I think it is important that we attain political will in this struggle to advance the right of children to education. I would call on the President, William Ruto, to take the lead and ensure that the ministry can really undertake the very mandate for which it was founded. It is important further to understand that if we analyze human development, we have to know that education is one of the key drivers for attaining human development. And therefore, as a country, we need to put a lot of priority, a lot of emphasis on the need for all our children, regardless of their circumstances, to access education so that we can develop our human capital in order for us to achieve the so-called Singapore dream and all that stuff as a country. Yeah.
Very lastly with you, Dr. Muira, do you think we realize the important role that education plays in society?
Well, I don't think we realize anymore, because if we do, we will not be experiencing the problems we are seeing. I mean, we will not be having problems of 50,000 kids not making it to, senior secondary because they can't afford school fees when we have the resources to do that in this country. I can tell you, I mean, you not so far away from here, Rwanda has managed to a free secondary education. We can afford it, but we must make it a priority, and we must vote those resources for it. And once we vote the resources, it is our business of government and everybody else to ensure that those resources get to those schools that are used to achieve that.
Indeed. And we must continue highlighting these issues. We cannot keep quiet about them. The needle must move at some point. Yeah. So thank you for joining us in this conversation this morning. And we're looking forward to continuing to speak about these things. Dr. Kilemi Muira is an education and governance expert and has joined us today with Dr. Davis Okomba, who's an educationist, as well as Santisana to you both for being part of this conversation. Can't keep our heads buried in the sand. We must talk about these things. Meant to be an equalizer, but then also meant to be a right. Let's keep talking. Good morning, 8 a.m.
Thank you very much.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Raise your arms with confidence with Nivea Derma Control.